Betty Thompson's old stiff hands stopped cutting her roses as she spotted two little black girls approaching her house. The 80-year-old widow watched, heart pounding, as the twins slowly made their way up her front walk. Their short, curly hair bounced with each step, eyes wide with a fear no child should know. As they reached the porch, Betty's breath caught in her throat. The girls looked up at her, their small faces filled with worry. Then, in voices barely above a whisper, they spoke words that would shatter Betty's quiet life and pull her into a nightmare she never expected to face. Before we dive in, comment below where you're watching or listening from today. And if you enjoy this shocking story, don't forget to subscribe. The gentle hum of bees mingled with the rustle of leaves as Betty tended to her beloved garden. At 80 years old, Betty found solace in the vibrant colors and delicate fragrances of her flowers. Each petal, each leaf, held memories of days gone by, of laughter shared with her late husband, George. As she carefully pruned a rosebush, her arthritic hands moving with practiced precision, Betty's mind wandered to the past. She remembered when this neighborhood bustled with life, children's laughter echoing down the street, neighbors chatting over fences, and the comforting aroma of backyard barbecues filling the air on warm summer evenings. Now the street stood eerily quiet. Many of the original families had moved away, their homes either standing empty or occupied by strangers who kept to themselves. Betty was one of the few remaining links to the neighborhood's vibrant past. She paused, wiping her brow with the back of her gardening glove, and gazed at the empty house next door. It had been on the market for months, a stark "for sale" sign, a constant reminder of the changing times. Betty sighed, feeling the weight of her loneliness press down upon her shoulders. Just as she was about to return to her pruning, a sound caught her attention. The distant rumble of an engine grew louder, and Betty's heart quickened with anticipation. She watched as a large moving truck lumbered down the street, its brakes squealing softly as it came to a stop in front of the vacant house. Betty's eyes widened with curiosity. New neighbors after all this time? She couldn't help but feel a flicker of excitement, a small spark of hope igniting in her chest. Perhaps this was the change the neighborhood needed, a chance to recapture some of its former vitality. As she watched, trying to appear busy with her gardening, Betty's mind raced with possibilities. Would they be a young family, bringing the sound of children's laughter back to the street? Or perhaps a retired couple, potential companions for afternoon teas and shared stories? The anticipation built as Betty waited for the first glimpse of her new neighbors. She found herself hoping for friendly faces, for people who might breathe new life into the quiet community she had watched slowly fade over the years. As Betty watched with barely concealed interest, a woman in her early 30s emerged from the passenger side of the moving truck. Her skin was a rich ebony, contrasting beautifully with the vibrant yellow sundress she wore. The woman's face bore a mix of excitement and apprehension as she surveyed her new surroundings. Following closely behind her were two little girls, their matching braids bouncing as they hopped down from the truck. They appeared to be around 6 years old, and their striking resemblance left no doubt that they were twins. Their eyes sparkled with curiosity as they took in the unfamiliar neighborhood. Betty's heart warmed at the sight of the children. It had been so long since the sound of young voices had filled the air on their street. She found herself smiling, already imagining the vitality these little ones might bring to the neighborhood. Just as Betty was about to raise her hand in a welcoming wave, movement from the driver's side of the truck caught her attention. A white man, appearing to be in his late 30s or early 40s, stepped out. He stretched, his muscular arms flexing as he surveyed the house and the neighborhood with a critical eye. Betty's brow furrowed slightly in confusion. The scene before her didn't quite align with her initial assumptions. She had expected the man to be the woman's husband and the girl's father, but the stark difference in their appearances gave her pause. Perhaps he's a new boyfriend, Betty mused to herself, constructing a story in her mind. Maybe she's recently divorced, and they're starting fresh together. It wasn't an uncommon situation these days, she reasoned, though she couldn't quite shake a nagging feeling of unease. As if sensing Betty's gaze, the woman turned and their eyes met. A warm smile spread across the newcomer's face, and Betty felt an immediate connection. She raised her hand in a friendly wave, her own smile widening in response. The moment was brief but significant. In that simple exchange, Betty felt a spark of hope. Perhaps this new family would bring some much-needed life and warmth back to the neighborhood. The moving truck, bearing the logo of a local company, pulled away after unloading only a few suitcases. It struck Betty as odd. Usually, new residents arrived with trucks full of furniture and boxes. This family seemed to be truly starting anew, with very little to their name. As much as Betty wanted to walk over and introduce herself immediately, she held back. They'll need some time to settle in, she thought, deciding to give them space. There'll be plenty of time for welcomes and introductions later. With a mixture of excitement and curiosity, Betty returned to her gardening, her mind filled with thoughts of her new neighbors. She looked forward to the possibility of new friendships and the return of a sense of community to her quiet street. As the sun began to set, casting a warm glow over the neighborhood, Betty gathered her gardening tools and headed inside. She cast one last glance at the house next door, where the new family had disappeared inside. The curtains were drawn and no sounds emanated from within. Betty couldn't shake the feeling that something was slightly off, but she pushed the thought aside. "Don't be silly," she chided herself. "They're probably just tired from the move." With that, she closed her own door, looking forward to what the coming days might bring. As evening settled over the neighborhood, Betty found herself in her cozy living room, embraced by the familiar comfort of her nightly ritual. The soft glow of the television mingled with the warm flicker of the fireplace, casting dancing shadows on the walls. In her hands, she cradled a delicate china teacup, steam rising gently from her favorite chamomile blend. This quiet moment had once been a cherished routine shared with George, her late husband. Now it served as both a comfort and a poignant reminder of his absence. Betty's eyes drifted to the empty armchair across from her, almost able to see George's kind smile and hear his gentle chuckle as they discussed their day. The house creaked softly, settling into the night, and Betty pulled her cardigan closer around her shoulders. She focused on the television, where a nature documentary showcased the serene beauty of a distant rainforest. The narrator's soothing voice and the tranquil scenes helped ease the ache of loneliness that often crept in during these quiet evening hours. Just as Betty was beginning to feel drowsy, lulled by the warmth of the fire and the calming tea, a sudden sharp sound jolted her to alertness. A loud bang, like something heavy falling or a door being slammed with great force, echoed through the night. It seemed to come from the direction of her new neighbor's house. Betty sat up straight, her heart racing. The bang was followed by what sounded like muffled screams, high-pitched and distressed. She strained her ears, trying to discern if she had truly heard cries or if it was just her imagination playing tricks on her. Silence fell again, broken only by the soft crackle of the fire and the low murmur of the television. Betty remained still, her tea forgotten, as she listened intently for any further sounds. Minutes ticked by, but nothing more disturbed the quiet of the night. Perhaps they're just settling in, Betty reasoned to herself, trying to calm her racing thoughts. Moving can be stressful, especially with young children. Maybe one of the girls had a tantrum or knocked something over. Yet, as much as she tried to rationalize the disturbance, a gnawing sense of unease settled in the pit of her stomach. The sound had been too sharp, too violent for a simple accident. And those screams. Betty shuddered, unable to shake the memory of the fear she thought she had heard. She considered going next door to check on the family, but hesitated. It was late, and she didn't want to seem nosy or intrusive. After all, she barely knew them. "I'm probably overreacting," she told herself, trying to shake off the discomfort. Betty finished her now-cold tea and went through the motions of preparing for bed. She turned off the television, banked the fire, and slowly made her way upstairs. But even as she lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, she couldn't quite shake the unsettled feeling that had taken root. As she drifted off to sleep, Betty made a decision. Tomorrow she would bake a cake and welcome her new neighbors properly. It was the neighborly thing to do, and perhaps it would put her mind at ease. The next morning dawned bright and clear, the unsettling events of the previous night feeling distant in the cheerful light of day. Betty rose early, determined to push aside her lingering concerns and focus on her plan to welcome the new neighbors. In her kitchen, Betty busied herself with the familiar routine of baking. She had decided on a classic lemon drizzle cake, a recipe passed down from her mother that had never failed to bring smiles to faces. As she mixed and measured, the kitchen filled with the comforting aroma of citrus and vanilla. While the cake baked, Betty tidied herself up, choosing a pretty floral blouse and her favorite cardigan. She wanted to make a good impression on the new family, hoping to foster a friendly relationship that might bring some life back into her quiet days. As she carefully frosted the cooled cake, Betty rehearsed what she might say. She was eager to invite them over for coffee, to learn more about them and make them feel welcome in the neighborhood. Perhaps the little girls would like to see her garden, or she could offer some local knowledge to help the family settle in. With the cake boxed and a warm smile on her face, Betty made her way next door. She noticed that the curtains were still drawn, and the house seemed eerily quiet for a home with 2 young children. Pushing aside a flicker of apprehension, she rang the doorbell. After a moment, the door opened, and Betty found herself face to face with Melanie, the woman she had seen yesterday. Up close, Betty could see the warmth in Melanie's dark eyes, though there was also a hint of something else, wariness perhaps, or fatigue. "Good morning," Betty said brightly, holding out the cake. "I'm Betty, your neighbor from next door. I thought I'd welcome you to the neighborhood with a little homemade treat." Melanie's face lit up with a genuine smile, the wariness melting away. "Oh, that's so kind of you. I'm Melanie. It's lovely to meet you properly." As Melanie reached out to accept the cake, Betty saw a flicker of movement behind her. Before she could say anything more, the man she had seen yesterday appeared in the doorway, his presence immediately changing the atmosphere. "Who is it, Mel?" he asked, his tone brusque and his eyes narrowing as they landed on Betty. Melanie's smile faltered slightly. "This is Betty, our neighbor. She's brought us a welcome cake." The man, Tom, Betty would learn, stepped forward, effectively blocking Melanie from view. "I'm Tom, Melanie's boyfriend," he said, his voice curt and unwelcoming. "Thanks for the cake, but we're pretty busy today. Lots of unpacking to do, you know." Betty felt her heart sink at his dismissive tone. "Oh, of course I understand," she said, trying to maintain her friendly demeanor. "I just wanted to invite you all over for coffee sometime when you're settled. It would be lovely to get to know you better." Tom's posture stiffened, and he kept the door partially closed, as if trying to hide the interior of the house from view. "That's not necessary," he said flatly. "We're private people. We'll let you know if we need anything." From behind Tom, Betty caught a glimpse of Melanie's face. The warmth had been replaced by a look of resigned disappointment, and she mouthed a silent "thank you" to Betty. Before Betty could say anything more, Tom took the cake box and began to close the door. "Thanks again for the cake. Have a good day," he said, his tone making it clear the conversation was over. The door shut with a finality that left Betty standing on the porch, feeling bewildered and slightly hurt. She had encountered reserved neighbors before, but something about this interaction felt off. Tom's abrupt manner, the way he had dismissed Melanie's evident friendliness, and the guarded way he had positioned himself in the doorway, all contributed to a growing sense of unease in Betty's mind. As she walked back to her own house, Betty couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss next door. The warmth and excitement she had felt about new neighbors was quickly being replaced by concern and a nagging worry. Betty spent the rest of the morning puttering around her house, trying to distract herself from her thoughts. But her mind kept returning to the strange interaction, to Melanie's silenced friendliness, and to the muffled sounds she had heard the night before. "Perhaps I'm just being a nosy old woman," she told herself, but deep down Betty knew that her instincts were rarely wrong. Something wasn't right in that house, and she couldn't help but wonder what might be happening behind those drawn curtains. As the afternoon sun began its descent, Betty found herself absently watering her collection of indoor plants. The familiar task usually brought her comfort, but today her mind was elsewhere, still mulling over the strange encounter with her new neighbors. She moved from plant to plant, her weathered hands gently tilting the watering can, when a flicker of movement outside caught her eye. Betty paused, peering out the window, and her heart skipped a beat at what she saw. The two little girls from next door, the twins she had glimpsed yesterday, were making their way across the lawn towards her house. Their movements were furtive, hunched over slightly, as if trying to make themselves smaller. Every few steps they would glance back at their own house, their little faces pinched with worry. Betty's brow furrowed with concern. This didn't look like the carefree exploration of children in a new neighborhood. There was an urgency, a fear in their movements, that set alarm bells ringing in Betty's mind. Setting down her watering can, Betty made her way to the front door. She opened it just as the girls reached her porch, their wide eyes looking up at her with a mixture of hope and apprehension. "Hello, dears," Betty said softly, crouching down to their level despite the protest of her aging knees. "Is everything all right?" The girls exchanged a nervous glance, and Betty's heart clenched at the fear she saw in their young faces. After a moment of hesitation, one of the twins leaned in close, her voice barely above a whisper. "Our new daddy doesn't like us." The words hit Betty like a physical blow. She felt the color drain from her face as she processed what the child had said. "What do you mean, sweetheart?" she asked gently, fighting to keep her voice calm. But before either girl could respond, a booming voice shattered the moment. "Girls, what do you think you're doing? Get back here right now." Betty looked up to see Tom striding across the lawn, his face a mask of barely contained anger. The twins flinched at the sound of his voice, their little bodies tensing with fear. "I'm so sorry," one of the girls whispered hurriedly. "We have to go." With one last pleading look at Betty, the twins turned and scurried back towards their house. Tom met them halfway, grabbing each by the arm and practically dragging them back to the house. Betty stood frozen on her porch, her heart pounding in her chest. The girls' words echoed in her mind, along with the image of their frightened faces. She watched helplessly as Tom ushered the twins inside, slamming the door behind them with such force that she could hear it even from across the yard. For several long moments, Betty remained rooted to the spot, her mind reeling from what had just transpired. The peaceful afternoon had shattered into something dark and unsettling, leaving her with a profound sense of dread. As the sound of the slammed door faded, Betty slowly made her way back inside her home. Her hands were shaking as she lowered herself into her favorite armchair, the weight of what she had just witnessed settling heavily upon her shoulders. "Our new daddy doesn't like us." The little girl's whispered words played on repeat in Betty's mind, each iteration sending a fresh wave of concern through her. She couldn't shake the image of the twins' frightened faces, nor the aggressive way Tom had handled them. Betty's thoughts raced as she tried to make sense of the situation. Was she overreacting? Perhaps Tom was just strict, and the girls were exaggerating as children sometimes do. But deep down she knew this was more than that. The fear in those young eyes was real, and it spoke of something far more sinister than mere strictness. As the minutes ticked by, Betty found herself caught in an internal struggle. Should she get involved? It wasn't her place to interfere in another family's affairs, was it? But then again, if something truly was wrong, could she live with herself if she did nothing? She thought of Melanie's silenced warmth during their brief interaction, of the muffled screams she'd heard the night before, and of Tom's overly controlling behavior. Each piece of the puzzle, when viewed alone, could be explained away. But together they painted a disturbing picture that Betty couldn't ignore. "What would George do?" she asked aloud, seeking guidance from her late husband's memory. She could almost hear his gentle voice urging her to trust her instincts, to err on the side of caution when it came to the welfare of children. With trembling hands, Betty reached for the phone on the side table. Her fingers hovered over the keypad as doubt crept in once more. What if she was wrong? What if she caused trouble for an innocent family? But then she remembered the twins' pleading looks, their hunched shoulders, as they tried to make themselves small and invisible. No child should ever have to feel that way in their own home. Taking a deep breath, Betty dialed 911. As the phone rang, she silently prayed she was doing the right thing. 911, what's your emergency? The operator's calm voice came through the line. Betty's voice quavered as she began to speak. I'm not sure if this is an emergency, but I'm very concerned about my new neighbors, especially the children. Can you tell me more about what's concerning you, Ma'am? The operator asked patiently. Slowly, Betty recounted everything she had observed over the past day and a half. She described the disturbing noises she'd heard, Tom's aggressive behavior, and most importantly, her interaction with the twins. The little girl told me their new daddy doesn't like them, Betty explained, her voice catching. And you should have seen how scared they looked when he called them back. I've never seen children so frightened. The operator listened attentively, asking clarifying questions here and there. When Betty had finished, there was a brief pause. Thank you for reporting this, Ma'am, the operator said, her tone serious. We take reports of potential child endangerment very seriously. I'm going to dispatch officers to your location to investigate. Can you provide me with your address and the address of the neighbors in question? Betty provided the requested information, feeling a mix of relief and apprehension. She had set something in motion now, something that couldn't be undone. Officers should be there shortly, the operator assured her. In the meantime, please don't attempt to intervene yourself. Stay in your home and wait for the police to arrive. After hanging up, Betty sat back in her chair, her heart racing. Had she done the right thing? Only time would tell. But as she thought once more of those frightened little girls, she knew she couldn't have lived with herself if she had chosen to do nothing. Now all she could do was wait and hope that help would arrive in time to make a difference. The wait for the police seemed interminable to Betty. She paced her living room, alternating between peering out the window and straining her ears for any sounds from next door. The neighborhood remained eerily quiet, which only served to heighten her anxiety. Just as Betty was considering calling 911 again, she heard the distant wail of sirens. The sound grew louder, and soon she saw 2 police cruisers turning onto her street, their lights flashing, but sirens now silent. Relief washed over Betty as she watched the officers exit their vehicles. There were 4 of them, 2 men and 2 women, all wearing expressions of calm professionalism. They conferred briefly near their cars before 2 of them approached Betty's house while the other 2 headed towards the neighbors. A firm knock on her door startled Betty despite her anticipation. She hurried to answer it, finding herself face to face with a middle-aged male officer and his younger female partner. "Good afternoon, ma'am," the male officer said, his voice kind but authoritative. "I'm Officer Johnson, and this is Officer Rivera. We're responding to a call about concerns for your neighbors. Are you the one who contacted us?" Betty nodded, suddenly feeling nervous. "Yes, that's right. I'm Betty Thompson. Please come in." She led the officers to her living room, where they all sat down. Officer Johnson pulled out a notepad, while Officer Rivera's keen eyes scanned the room, taking in details of Betty's home. "Mrs. Thompson, can you walk us through what led you to call us today?" Officer Johnson asked, pen poised over his notepad. Taking a deep breath, Betty recounted the events of the past day and a half. She described the unsettling noises she'd heard the first night, the strange interaction when she'd tried to welcome the family with a cake, and finally, the frightening encounter with the twins. As she spoke, Betty could see the officers exchanging glances. They asked clarifying questions, their expressions growing more serious as Betty shared more details. "And you're certain the little girl said, 'Our new daddy doesn't like us'?" Officer Rivera asked, speaking for the first time. Her dark eyes were intense, focused. Betty nodded emphatically. "Yes, those were her exact words, and if you could have seen how terrified they looked when that man, Tom, called them back. I've never seen children so afraid." Officer Johnson made a few more notes before closing his notepad. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. You did the right thing by calling us. We take reports like this very seriously, especially when children are involved. What happens now? Betty asked, her hands twisting anxiously in her lap. We're going to go next door and do a welfare check, Officer Rivera explained. We'll speak with the adults, and if possible, with the children separately. Our colleagues are already over there. Officer Johnson added, We may need to ask you a few more questions later, Mrs. Thompson. Would you be willing to provide a formal statement if necessary? Of course, Betty agreed without hesitation. Anything I can do to help those little girls. The officers stood and Betty walked them to the door. As they were about to leave, Officer Rivera turned back to Betty. Mrs. Thompson, I want to commend you for your attentiveness and willingness to get involved. Many people would have ignored their concerns or convinced themselves it wasn't their business. Your actions today may have made a real difference. Betty felt a lump form in her throat at the officer's words. I just hope everything turns out all right, she said softly. We'll do everything we can, Officer Johnson assured her. Please stay inside for now. We'll update you when we can. As the officers made their way next door, Betty closed her door and leaned against it, her heart pounding. She sent up a silent prayer for the safety of Melanie and the twins, hoping against hope that her worst fears wouldn't be confirmed. Through her window, Betty watched as the officers approached her neighbor's house. She saw them knock, wait, then knock again more forcefully. The scene before her felt surreal, like something out of a television drama rather than her quiet suburban street. From her vantage point at the window, Betty watched as the front door of her neighbor's house finally opened. Melanie appeared in the doorway, her body language tense and guarded. Even from a distance, Betty could see the woman's eyes darting nervously between the officers and something, or someone, inside the house. The officers spoke to Melanie for a few moments, their stance non-threatening but firm. Betty couldn't hear what was being said, but she could see Melanie nodding, her shoulders slumping slightly as if in resignation. Just as it seemed the officers might be invited inside, Tom's imposing figure appeared behind Melanie. Even from across the yard, Betty could sense the hostility radiating from him. His face was set in a scowl, his body positioned protectively, or was it possessively, behind Melanie. Betty's heart raced as she observed the tense scene unfolding. She saw Tom gesticulating angrily, his voice raised enough that she could hear the angry tone, if not the words themselves. The officers remained calm, one of them speaking in what appeared to be a placating manner, while the other kept a watchful eye on Tom's increasingly agitated movements. After what felt like an eternity, but was likely only a few minutes, Betty saw one of the officers, the female officer she had spoken to earlier, gently pull Melanie aside. Tom made a move as if to follow, but the male officer stepped between them, his stance firm and unyielding. The confrontation at the door continued, with Tom becoming increasingly agitated. His voice rose further, and Betty could now make out fragments of his angry protests. No right. Private property. Mind your own business. The male officer remained steadfast, his calm demeanor a stark contrast to Tom's growing rage. Betty watched, her hands pressed against the cool glass of her window, as the situation teetered on a knife's edge. Where were the twins, Betty wondered, her eyes scanning what little she could see of the house's interior. Were they witnessing this confrontation? The thought of those little girls cowering in fear somewhere inside made Betty's heart ache. Suddenly Tom's voice rose to a shout. You can't do this. You have no right to talk to her alone. Betty gasped as she saw Tom lunge forward, his hand reaching out as if to grab Melanie. In an instant, the calm facade of the officers shattered. The male officer swiftly moved to restrain Tom, while his partner ushered Melanie further away from the door. The scene erupted into chaos. Tom struggled against the officer, his face contorted with rage. More shouting ensued, and Betty saw the other two officers who had been waiting by the police cruisers rush to assist their colleagues. In the midst of the commotion, Betty caught a glimpse of movement in an upstairs window. Two small faces peered out briefly before disappearing again. The twins, witnessing the unfolding drama. Betty's hand flew to her mouth, tears welling in her eyes. This was all her fault, wasn't it? She had set this in motion with her phone call. But even as guilt threatened to overwhelm her, a small voice in the back of her mind whispered that she had done the right thing. Whatever was happening now, it was bringing to light something that had been hidden, festering in the shadows. As she watched Tom being forcibly restrained and Melanie being led away by the female officer, Betty sent up another silent prayer. She prayed for Melanie's strength, for the twins' safety, and for justice to prevail. The quiet afternoon had erupted into a storm, and Betty knew that nothing would ever be the same again. All she could do now was hope that from this chaos, a better future would emerge for Melanie and her daughters. Partially obscured by a large rhododendron bush, Melanie stood with Officer Rivera. Even from a distance, Betty could see the tension in the young woman's posture. Melanie's arms were wrapped tightly around herself, as if trying to hold herself together. Officer Rivera stood close, her stance protective yet giving Melanie space. Betty couldn't hear their conversation, but she could see Officer Rivera speaking softly, her expression compassionate. Melanie shook her head several times, her gaze fixed on the ground. The officer persisted, gently coaxing, and slowly, Betty saw Melanie's resolve begin to crumble. It started with a slight trembling of Melanie's shoulders. Then, as if a dam had broken, Melanie's composure shattered completely. She buried her face in her hands, her body racked with sobs. Officer Rivera placed a comforting hand on Melanie's arm, speaking words that Betty couldn't hear but could imagine were filled with reassurance and support. For several minutes Melanie cried, years of pent-up emotion pouring out. Betty's heart ached for the young woman, wishing she could offer comfort herself. Eventually Melanie's sobs subsided, and she began to speak, her words punctuated by hiccups and sniffles. Though Betty couldn't make out the words, she could see the pain etched on Melanie's face as she spoke. Officer Rivera listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each passing moment. She asked questions periodically, her notepad out now, jotting down Melanie's responses. As the conversation continued, Betty saw Melanie's posture change. The hunched, defensive stance gradually gave way to something straighter, stronger. It was as if each word she spoke was lifting a weight from her shoulders. After what seemed like an eternity, Officer Rivera nodded solemnly and put away her notepad. She placed both hands on Melanie's shoulders, looking her directly in the eyes as she spoke. Melanie nodded, wiping away tears with the back of her hand. Just then, a commotion from the front of the house drew their attention. Tom's angry shouts had risen in volume again, and Betty could see him struggling against the officer's hold. Melanie flinched at the sound, instinctively stepping back. Officer Rivera quickly positioned herself between Melanie and the source of the noise, her stance protective. She spoke rapidly into her radio, her free hand remaining on Melanie's arm in a gesture of support. Moments later, 2 more police cruisers arrived on the scene, their sirens piercing the afternoon quiet. Betty watched as additional officers swarmed the area, their presence bringing a sense of order to the chaos. Tom's shouts had devolved into a stream of obscenities, his face contorted with rage as he continued to struggle against the officers restraining him. His eyes darted wildly, seeking escape, but the increased police presence had effectively cut off any chance of flight. One of the newly arrived officers approached, a pair of handcuffs glinting in the afternoon sun. Tom's eyes widened at the sight, his struggles intensifying. "You can't do this," he bellowed, his voice cracking with desperation. "I haven't done anything wrong. This is all a misunderstanding." But his protests fell on deaf ears. With practiced efficiency, the officers secured Tom's wrists behind his back, the click of the handcuffs seeming to echo in the sudden hush that had fallen over the street. As Tom was being restrained, Betty's attention was drawn to movement near the house. Melanie, accompanied by Officer Rivera, was slowly making her way towards the front yard. Her face was tear-stained, but set with a determination that Betty hadn't seen before. Tom's eyes locked onto Melanie, and his demeanor shifted instantly. "Mel, baby, tell them this is all a mistake," he pleaded, his voice taking on a wheedling tone. "You know I love you and the girls. We're happy, aren't we? Tell them." Melanie flinched at his words but stood her ground. Officer Rivera placed a supportive hand on her shoulder, and Melanie seemed to draw strength from the touch. She lifted her chin and spoke, her voice quiet but firm. "No more lies, Tom, it's over." Tom's face contorted with rage once more. "You ungrateful snake," he snarled, lunging towards Melanie despite his restraints. The officers holding him tightened their grip, pulling him back. "That's enough," one of the officers said sternly. "You're under arrest for domestic abuse and child endangerment. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the officer continued reading Tom his rights, Betty saw Melanie sag slightly, as if a great weight had been lifted from her shoulders. Officer Rivera was there immediately, supporting her and speaking words of encouragement that Betty couldn't hear. The neighbors who had gathered to watch the scene unfold began to murmur among themselves. Betty could see shock and disbelief on their faces, mixed with sympathy as they looked at Melanie. She wondered how many of them, like her, had sensed that something was wrong but had been too uncertain or afraid to act. As Tom was being led to one of the police cruisers, still shouting protests and threats, Betty's attention was caught by movement at the front door of the house. The twins, looking small and frightened, were being gently ushered out by another officer. Their eyes were wide as they took in the chaotic scene, and they clung to each other's hands tightly. When Melanie saw her daughters, she broke away from Officer Rivera and rushed to them, dropping to her knees and enveloping them in a fierce embrace. The three clung to each other, their bodies shaking with sobs that were equal parts relief and fear of the unknown future that lay ahead. Betty felt tears welling up in her own eyes as she watched this bittersweet reunion. The family's pain was palpable, but so was the love between mother and daughters. In that moment, Betty knew without a doubt that she had done the right thing by making that call. As Tom was placed in the back of a police cruiser, his angry shouts muffled by the closed door, Betty saw one of the officers approach Melanie and the twins. The officer spoke gently, explaining that they needed to come to the station to give their statements and ensure their safety. Melanie nodded, gathering her daughters close as they were led to the vehicle. Just before getting into the car, Melanie's gaze swept across the gathered neighbors, finally landing on Betty's window. Their eyes met, and Melanie gave a small, tremulous smile. A smile of gratitude, of acknowledgement, of shared understanding. Betty raised her hand in a small wave, trying to convey all her support and compassion in that simple gesture. As the police cruisers disappeared around the corner, their sirens fading into the distance, an eerie calm descended upon the street. The neighbors who had gathered to watch the dramatic scene unfold began to disperse, their hushed conversations creating a low murmur that gradually faded as they returned to their homes. Betty remained at her window, her heart still racing from the intensity of what she had witnessed. She felt drained, both emotionally and physically, as if she had been an active participant in the events, rather than a distant observer. Just as she was considering stepping away from the window, movement caught her eye. The police cruiser carrying Melanie and the twins had returned, pulling up in front of the house. Betty watched as an officer opened the car door, and Melanie emerged, holding tightly to her daughter's hands. The small family stood for a moment on the sidewalk, looking lost and uncertain. Melanie seemed to be steeling herself, taking deep breaths as she gazed at the house that had been both their home and their prison. Suddenly, as if by some unspoken agreement, the two little girls broke free from their mother's grasp. To Betty's surprise and concern, they began running, not towards the house, but across the lawn towards her own home. Betty's heart leapt into her throat. Without thinking, she rushed to her front door, flinging it open just as the twins reached her porch. Their little faces were streaked with tears, their eyes wide with a mixture of fear and hope. "Oh, my dears," Betty breathed, dropping to her knees despite the protest of her aging joints. She opened her arms, and the girls fell into them without hesitation, their small bodies shaking with sobs. As she held them close, Betty felt her own eyes welling up with tears. She could feel the trembling of their tiny frames, could sense the relief and fear and confusion all tangled up in their embrace. "You're safe now," she murmured, her voice choked with emotion. "You're safe." One of the twins lifted her tear-stained face, her voice barely above a whisper. "Thank you for helping us," she said, her words carrying a weight far beyond her years. Betty's heart shattered and mended all at once. She hugged the girls tighter, wishing she could shield them from all the pain and uncertainty that lay ahead. "You're very brave," she told them softly. "Both of you." Movement in her peripheral vision made Betty look up. Melanie was making her way across the lawn, her steps hesitant but determined. As she reached the porch, Betty could see the myriad emotions playing across the young woman's face: gratitude, shame, relief, fear. "I'm so sorry," Melanie began, her voice trembling. "I don't know what to say, how to thank you." Betty shook her head, still holding the twins close. "There's no need to thank me," she said gently. "I just did what I hope anyone would do." Melanie's composure crumbled at these words. She sank to her knees beside Betty and her daughters, tears flowing freely down her cheeks. "I was so scared," she confessed, her words barely audible. "I didn't know how to get out, how to protect them. I thought no one would believe me." "Oh, my dear," Betty said, reaching out to clasp Melanie's hand. "You're the brave one. It takes so much courage to speak up, to break free." For a long moment, they remained there on Betty's porch, an unlikely group brought together by circumstance and compassion. The twins nestled between Betty and their mother, their sobs gradually subsiding into hiccups. Melanie held tightly to Betty's hand, as if drawing strength from the older woman's steady presence. Betty made a silent vow to herself that she would be there for this family, in whatever way she could. She might be old, she thought, but she still had love to give, still had the power to make a difference. As if reading her thoughts, Melanie squeezed her hand. "Thank you," she said again, her voice stronger now, "for everything." Betty smiled, her heart full. "We'll get through this together," she promised. In the aftermath of Tom's arrest, Betty's role shifted from concerned neighbor to steadfast supporter of Melanie and the twins. Her quiet home became a haven for the small family as they began to rebuild their lives. Betty's kitchen table, once a place of solitary meals, now hosted frequent gatherings. Melanie would often stop by for coffee, finding comfort in Betty's sympathetic ear and wise counsel. The twins, Emily and Sophia, grew to love their visits, drawn by Betty's warmth and the sense of safety they felt in her presence. As Melanie navigated the complex legal proceedings that followed Tom's arrest, Betty stepped in to help with childcare. She watched the girls while Melanie attended court dates, meetings with lawyers, and counseling sessions. Under Betty's gentle care, the twins slowly began to relax and show signs of their true personalities. Betty's support extended beyond emotional comfort. She helped Melanie wade through the sea of paperwork required for social services and legal aid. Her dining room became a makeshift office, scattered with forms and pamphlets, as they worked together to secure the resources Melanie and the girls needed. The transformation in the small family was gradual but unmistakable. Melanie's posture straightened, her voice grew stronger, and a spark of determination lit her eyes. The twins, once shy and withdrawn, now filled Betty's home with laughter and the patter of playful feet. During one of their now frequent meals together, Sophia paused, her fork halfway to her mouth, and looked up at Betty with serious eyes. "Are you our guardian angel?" she asked innocently. Betty felt her heart swell with emotion. "Oh, my dear," she replied, her voice soft. "I'm just a neighbor who cares." Melanie reached across the table, grasping Betty's hand. "You're so much more than that," she said, her eyes shining with gratitude. "I don't know how we would have managed without you." As Betty looked around at the faces of her newfound family, she realized that in helping them heal, she had found healing of her own. The loneliness that had plagued her since George's passing had been replaced by a sense of purpose and connection. Her quiet life had been transformed into something richer and more rewarding.